We continue to really just explain what the guidelines say. And, the story is not only the pyramid graphic, but it's also the report.
You may want to look at it as an opportunity to educate and kind of modernize the narrative around wheat and grain-based foods in ways that are more relevant.
Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. That was Erin Ball with the Grain Foods Foundation and Leah Johnston with Wildhive Strategic Communications. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Erin Ball is the Executive Director of the Grain Foods Foundation, and Leah Johnston is the Director of Nutrition Strategies and Communications with Wildhive Strategic Communications. Leah is also a credentialed registered dietitian. Erin, let's start with you, and thanks for joining us on the podcast. Why don't we start by you giving us a quick refresher of who the Grain Foods Foundation is and what your mission is?
Of course, and thank you, Erin, for inviting us. Leah and I work together all the time, but to do a show together with you is really fun, so thank you. The Grain Foods Foundation is basically an unbranded, pre-competitive public relations appendage, I guess, of the grain foods industry. We formed in response to the Atkins diet craze about more than 20 years ago now. Bread bakers and flour millers and others in the industry were just really concerned that things being said about carbohydrates and their products specifically were not true. And while there was of course a sales implication of that, you all know grain foods folks from grower to retailer are really proud of the products that they're growing for, making, and selling. And it was really important that to those folks and to us now that the truth was put out there and pushed out there about the importance of grain foods in the diet. And we've really been doing that ever since for a long time. Well, 20 plus years, which seems like a long time. We really kind of did a pivot in 2014, 2015, where we began to invest in nutrition science research. You can only retool the positive grain foods message so many times. And while those messages were still very strong and being used really across the grain foods supply chain, we wanted to be able to say more and deeper things about the importance of grain foods in the diet. So we began investing in nutrition science research. That was just the beginning. In 2022 and 2023, we did some strategic planning and articulated research as one of our 5 strategic pillars. That research supports a nationwide communications program that we are very hard at work at all of the time. And we're always looking for the next thing. We typically message to health influencers. This fall and winter, we've been messaging directly to consumers. It's a very critical time, an intense time for our category, and our board actually released funds from our reserves. You have the rainy day fund, and the board said this is the rainy day. And so we've been pushing out a message campaign really that we call Grain Foods Make the Moment since November, which has been kind of the latest and greatest thing at GFF. And then recently we funded 4 or 5, depending on how you count, new research projects. So always more happening. That's sort of the story right now.
Well, and having that research to back all the messaging that's sending out is critical. And Leah, glad to have you on the program here. Maybe you can just give us the elevator pitch real quick on the health benefits of wheat. Remind our audience and arm them with the information they need to know about wheat.
Sure. Thank you again for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Wheat is, I look at it as kind of a nutritional powerhouse that goes under the radar a lot. It's a significant contributor to dietary fiber, which we all know is an under-consumed nutrient in the United States right now. So it's a very, very important contributor to fiber, which is a big part of the nutrition conversation and trending conversations right now. And another nutrient that wheat has is wheat protein that also gets overlooked and should be talked about in the conversation with plant proteins as well. And then we have a lot of other nutrients that wheat provides: vitamin E, vitamin B6, magnesium. And then if we talk about enriched wheat, Then we're getting even further into nutritional benefits with B vitamins, folic acid, folate, which is a really important, has had a really important public health impact since it's mandated in 1998. So this is why I kind of look at all wheat and grains as sort of nutritional powerhouses that often get overlooked, that need to be put back into the conversation.
Thanks for that update on that. It's a good refresher for everybody to remember that, and it's kind of the basis for our discussion here. Erin, the big news that was released in January was this new dietary guidelines and kind of what we're calling an inverted food pyramid that shifted grains to the smaller part of that pyramid. It's really a wholesale change. Protein, vegetables now occupy the base. Grains are at their smallest points. How has the Grain Foods Foundation reacted to this?
So, great question. That's been really what we've done together since prior to January, even. Many of you know, probably everyone knows, DC is a gossip-based town, and there was gossip that there was going to be an inverted pyramid even December and before. And we were surprised, but then not shocked when the announcement was officially made in January. Because of the rumors we had heard and our own concerns, knowing that some of the folks working in this administration are not carb lovers. They're not pushing carbohydrates, and especially not grain-based carbohydrates. We had actually already begun to think about how we were going to message when the news was released and what we needed to do moving forward into a world where these were the government-endorsed dietary guidelines. So even prior to the release, we were working with a researcher named Adam Drunowski to put a research project in place that would actually model out what happens to a consumer nutritionally if they eat according to this new inverted pyramid. Not only nutritionally, that was of course what I approached Adam about, was can you model this out? Because in a normal, I would say, dietary guidelines cycle, the advisory committee and or USDA staff would have modeled out the nutritional implications of a new pattern. That did not seem to happen this time, and so we wanted to do that because I think there are some concerning nutritional implications with the new pattern. However, in reaching out to Dr. Drunowski, who's out of the University of Washington, he also has an interest in cost. And I think we can all look at the new pyramid and imagine where there might be some increased costs for not only consumers, but for programs like school lunch, school breakfast, the Child and Adult Care and Feeding Program, CACFP. And so Adam also wants to do kind of this is a very crude description, but it's a cost per calorie calculation. So that paper is actually underway. It was underway prior to the release of the guidelines. We continue to really just explain what the guidelines say. And, the story is not only the pyramid graphic, but it's also the report that came out with it. There's also a significant appendix or addendum, I can't remember which it's called, that sort of gives what this administration has called the scientific validation or explanation for the new guidelines. So I think GFF's role has been really to explain. There are a lot of really tricky politics in the mix right now, and GFF sits a little bit outside of that. We do not lobby. We could, but we don't. And so we really sit outside as almost like the third party objective voice for the grain foods category. And so we've sought to explain, we're seeking to advocate, and to point out where there might be real concerns with the new guidelines. We're of course doing that through research, through conversations with experts, and making sure we also understand what consumers understand or don't understand about the new guidelines. Working with other groups, the International Food Information Council is a group we've been working with to understand consumers and the new guidelines. It's a lot. In a sense, it's like as of January, we have a whole new job, not instead of our old job, but in addition to. And so we've been working really hard.
Well, Leah, following up on that, kind of what Erin said, there is a gap between what the actual pyramid image communicates and what the guidelines are saying. So from a communication standpoint, what's your playbook? How do you compete with an image such as the food pyramid that might be in classrooms and with what the dietary guidelines are saying?
Yeah, I think you don't try to compete necessarily. The goal is to kind of reframe the moment and come from a perspective of being on offense rather than on defense. When we have a federal visual that kind of shifts perception, trying to argue against it may backfire and reinforce it, actually. So instead, we may want to look at it as an opportunity to educate and kind of modernize the narrative around wheat and grain-based foods in ways that are more relevant to how people actually live and eat. The dietary guidelines may have a classroom visible, but they don't own the full consumer conversation, and that's where our communications can really lead. So what might that look like in practice? It starts by simplifying the science, and Erin talked a little bit about the science and some really interesting stuff that the Grain Foods Foundation and the Grain Foods Research Institute is working on, taking that science, drilling it down into clear benefit-driven messaging that shows up and resonates with people's everyday lives. So I'm talking like very simple messaging that's going to appeal to an individual. So like fiber for gut health or sustained energy, satisfaction, or talking about the role that grains play in building balanced meals. So instead of abstract nutrition concepts, connecting grains to real moments like breakfast routines and family dinners and quick lunches, and showing up where decisions are actually being made. And that's what the goal of the Grain Foods Make the Moment campaign was all about, that Erin talked about a little bit. And I think we need to show up where it counts, not necessarily in a classroom, because that's not where decisions are being made. So showing up maybe in the retail environments or on shelves, on pack, helping consumers to make easy and confident choices without overwhelming them with competing claims or arguing or feeling like we have to be on the defense. We don't have to be on the defense in this situation. I think it can be an opportunity to modernize and kind of reframe the message and to connect to people's emotions and not just be educational.
So, Erin, this, as you mentioned, trickles down to kind of the school meal standards. And I know there's probably been some pushback from school nutrition professionals, getting rid of some of the basics like pasta and tortillas, or kind of marginalizing those. What is the Grain Foods Foundation? How can you engage with USDA to protect grains in the school meals?
So there are a few things. One is not intuitive and wasn't even intuitive for me, but I'm really convinced that it's important now. We have been in conversation with groups like the School Nutrition Association, who represent the professionals who are actually feeding children and teenagers in schools. That group is really emphasizing the need to slow down. This process has moved fast, from a new administration to a decision about new guidelines that were not based on the past 5 years of research, to now this kind of almost, it feels like a race to implement those guidelines into school nutrition and the other places we've discussed. So the School Nutrition Association and others surrounding them, other food folks, are really, first of all, asking USDA to slow it down. Let there be some backup, some research to show that implementing these guidelines is doable. There are layers of things happening that make the implementation of these guidelines difficult. Cost is primary. The School Nutrition Association is really great at breaking down like what happens to that full price meal in the school, which many children aren't paying. So, but of that, like $4.30, it's very little that's actually going to food costs. It's largely labor cost, which of course the folks feeding our children should be compensated at least minimally for that. But that means there isn't a lot of margin to start buying foods that may be more expensive than what's been traditional on school menus. Additionally, and everyone's been talking about this lately, so I'm not saying anything new, but many school cafeterias are not built to implement the guidelines. We heard the story recently of a school lunch lady who was up on the hill talking to Hillstaff about her concerns about implementing the guidelines in her cafeteria. And she said, here's the equipment I have. I have one cooler, that's where we put the milk, and I have one of those warming, I don't know what it's like, it's an oven, but not an oven. One of those. So she's got a refrigerator for the milk and a warming thing, and that's it. She's supposed to serve kids from that equipment. And so, it's not just the nutritional concern about rolling out the guidelines, it's that schools are not prepared. They're not equipped to cook fresh food, to keep fresh food in a refrigerator. So we're really echoing the concerns of that group because, of course, everyone, I think we could all agree, we want kids to have the most nutritious meals possible in schools. We need to equip schools to provide those, and we also need to affirm school lunch professionals are doing incredible things with very limited resources. And I think that's gotten a little lost in the narrative as well. So yes, we have grain foods concerns, to go, if the move was to only 100% whole grains and very limited servings of those across a day. So if you think of school breakfast, school lunch, and some schools provide the snack after school, maybe only 2 grain food servings across the day, and those could be mandated to be 100% whole grain, not just whole grain rich. It could go to 100% whole grain. That's a concern. That's a concern in terms of kids accepting that. And the limited number of servings, our body needs energy. Children need energy to learn and to play, and grain foods are such a great source of energy and other nutrients alongside that. And so there are layers of concerns about these new guidelines and how they might play out in a school feeding situation and some of those other programs supported by federal dollars.
Hey, Erin, this is Justin, and just want to make sure that you know how much we appreciate you taking time to be on Erin's podcast, Wheat's on Your Mind, and so it continues to grow, and the reason it continues to grow is getting good guests and conversations like this, so thank you to you and Leah for making time. But as we look at it from a grower's perspective, the work that Grain Food Foundation is doing, we really admire under your leadership, you've got several pillars of strength where you've got your industry contribution and support, and with your board of trustees, you've got your dietary network and your research that you're doing and your outreach that you're able to do through social media. It's just the number of followers that you have and hits and clicks that you get is really amazing, and being able to get that message out about grain foods. And so I just want to make sure that we give you a compliment about the work that you're doing under your leadership. But thank you. And I do know one of the topics also that your organization is going to be working on and trying to help with that messaging is something that we're aware of, and we're working with our industry partners as well, and what impact it might have is around ultra-processed foods and that definition and how we communicate and have discussion with the decision makers about that. If you could expand a little bit more about the work that Grain Food Foundation's doing around that topic of UPFs.
Yeah, of course. And first of all, thank you, Justin, for the props, but I should say thank you to you for coming to our board meeting, for being a grower voice. I think the world of working together more closely is here, and we've been able to do that really in the past year. So thank you, Justin. And some of the research I've mentioned is being in part funded by some of the state commissions, including Kansas. So thank you for that as well. I really, we're talking about we all need to work together right now. And at least from my perspective at GFF, that is happening in some really productive ways. And you've been a real part of that. So thank you. UPF, well, we could do a whole other call about UPF. So in short, the scientific dialogue continues, and there is a lot of disagreement. There are multiple voices at the table, even scientifically. And then when you bring in the food industry, when you bring in food journalists who have actually been a big part of this dialogue, there are just so many voices. I've said this in other contexts, and it's true with UPF too. Everyone is an influencer, and everyone is being influenced. And so, some of the messages that are influencing consumers from the federal level are not science-based. Really very little has been decided scientifically about UPF, and even the research is mixed. In some of the research that would use a particular definition for UPF and hold that up against health outcomes, grain foods are actually favorable in that kind of measure. So even in the UPF world, we need, if we're going to talk about some of the weaker research, there are some wins for grain foods there. I say that kind of with a whispered voice, but it's important that we can kind of trade in this economy of research-based message. So there's so much going on. I think what we hope happens and what I hear happening in some quarters is sort of okay, ultra-processed foods, what does it mean? You know, we've heard the FDA is even having a hard time defining it and perhaps may lean into a white paper versus like a policy document or regulation. What we do know is that there is proven science around too much added sugar, too much salt, too much saturated fat. And we hear in some quarters the messaging circling back to those three nutrients of concern, basically, rather than trying to talk about ultra-processed foods because it's such a mixed message. As we know in the grain world, I mean, enriched and fortified cereals are central to some families' morning nutrition and maybe afternoon nutrition. Those are in the ultra-processed foods category, but even some of the sweeter cereals, maybe the treat cereals, are still bringing a lot of important nutrition to the table. Should we slap a UPF sticker on that? I don't think so. So I think some folks are circling back around towards more realistic message. And I think some of those folks are at USDA. I think some of those folks are in the food industry. And I think, you know, the research community, scientists want to answer questions and they want research to generate new questions. And so for the research community, they're talking about the findings in epidemiological data, where they're trying to get funding for randomized controlled trials, so human feeding trials with UPFs. It's been a very difficult slog. I mean, I've watched a couple groups try for 2 years to fund a project. I think we need to help science move the discussion forward. Many scientists don't have an agenda. They just want to do the science. They need funding for that. We've got to support that. And I do think we need to talk about nutrition and not processing. And that's really where that sugar, salt, and fat, sort of returning to those messages, those are nutrition messages, not processing messages. And I think there are a lot of other nutrition messages that we, especially in the grain food space, can lean on instead of this ambiguous processing or ingredient, or, you know, it's framed in so many different ways. I think we need to talk about nutrition.
Leah, do you have anything to add on to that about ultra-processed food?
There's so much I could say, but I agree with Erin that the focus needs to be on nutrition, and it's such a broad category that the research and the narrative right now is not focused on nutrition. It's just focused on, I shouldn't say that. They're trying to equate processing with nutritional value, which is not really accurate. It's not the full picture. I always go back to when we're talking about nutrition and looking at this in a different light. Erin mentioned a study that Dr. Dranowski is doing right now, a modeling study, but he also published a study last year with looking at NHANES data. And what it did was categorize grain foods in a different way. So it took both whole grains, whole wheat, and refined grains and looked at them from a nutritional nutrient density standpoint and created a criteria for what's called healthy grains category. And we had both whole wheat and some refined grain foods that fell into this healthy grains category. And what they found with the healthy grains category is that it was associated with better diet quality and better metabolic incomes. And it included both whole grains and refined grains because there can be nutritional value in both. So that's why I think I agree with Erin that it's so important to talk about the nutrition and leading with that message, and even leading with the healthy grains category and getting that message out there and helping people to understand that, I think is really important in this environment right now.
Erin, as we wrap this up, let's talk about messaging specifically to our wheat farmer audience, what advice do you have for them to help amplify the message that the Grain Foods Foundation is putting out there, and maybe offer some resources that are available to them?
Yes. So I would start with thank you, wheat farmers, for growing an incredible product that we talk about at GFF, and that is part of these products that consumers see on grocery shelves. So here's something I learned when I came to GFF that I still find unbelievable to this day. So I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in Missouri. I'm married to a man from Kansas who grew up on a wheat farm. I was very familiar with the fact that wheat starts out in the ground as a plant and then becomes flour and then becomes bread or whatever. A lot of Americans, and this sounds crazy, but it's true, a lot of Americans do not know where flour comes from and what wheat is, and that it starts out as a plant. And so I would say to our grower partners, please be patient with the people you may be talking to who may not understand that wheat starts out as a plant and then moves through the supply chain in some pretty simple ways that are kind of easy to explain. I mean, milling is pretty easy to explain when you boil it down. Now, maybe it's not your neighbors in the Midwest who don't understand about wheat being a plant, but when you come to DC, when you're on the Hill, maybe even sometimes when you're talking to some of your state regulators, you have to start at the very beginning, and you have to do it patiently and with a smile on your face, but you start with wheat as a plant. I think leaning into this idea of the plant-based halo, grain foods are plant-based foods, and as Leah already mentioned, wheat brings plant-based protein to the table. I think that's sort of the sum of that health halo language that we can sort of live under a little bit. I also think it's important to talk about our products. Besides sort of teenage boys, no one gets a bag of like a loaf of bread and just sits and eats slice after slice. I've heard that some teenage boys do that, but most people eat bread or pasta or cereal or a bagel, whatever, with something else. And Americans are not only deficient in fiber, which that's so true. I can only underline and bold what Leah said about that. No one eats enough fruits and vegetables. Almost no one eats enough fruits and vegetables. Well, what's the perfect partner food? And really, how do we eat fruits and vegetables? Yes, you might have a salad. There's probably a piece of bread with that salad that actually sort of is the more exciting part of the salad, to be honest. What do you put on the sandwich to make it a little healthier? It's vegetables. It's fruit with your cereal, fruit in your yogurt, with the granola on top, because, the granola is the treat. I think we have to talk about ways if we want to move Americans towards better diet quality, and we do, grain foods are so central to that because they help deliver more of what we're not getting enough of. And they do that in a way that, it's not you with a plate of celery. It's a lovely bowl of oatmeal or cereal with strawberries and bananas. And it's not, I do like a plate of plain pasta, but usually it's not plain pasta. It's pasta with mushrooms and tomatoes and peppers. And I just think there's a lot to say about we are part of supporting the nutrition of American consumers. And I think that's such a powerful message for growers. And I think the most important things are to contextualize the message, understand what your audience doesn't understand, and then communicate that we're part of moving people towards better diet quality. That needs to be said by everyone along the supply chain. We're certainly saying it at GFF, and I would invite growers who are probably already saying that to say it more, to say it more loudly, and to say it to more audiences.
Great advice there. Erin and Leah, thank you for your hard work and your efforts, and thanks for sharing today that advice and updates on what you're doing. And keep up the good work. We'll certainly have you back on the podcast again because there's always so much more to talk about. But thank you so much for joining us. That was Erin Ball with the Grain Foods Foundation and Leah Johnston with Wildhive Strategic Communications. My thanks to both of them for being on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast, talking a little bit about wheat nutrition. If you're enjoying this podcast, please tell your friends about it and subscribe wherever you find your podcast. Previous episodes can always be found at wheatsonyourmind.com.